Good morning everybody, welcome to another global stamping video hop. My name's Jo, I'm from the UK, and today we are sharing a single layer card. I have to be honest, it part fills me with dread, it part fills me with excitement because it's one of those things that is completely out of my comfort zone. But I'm up for a challenge, so let's have a go. So I'm going to be creating what I call on the hoof today. So I've got an image in my mind. I'm going to be recording live as I create. So I haven't got anything to show you to start with. I'm literally just going to go for it and see what happens today. So this could go terribly wrong, but let's have a look and try. So I'm going to be using the Joy of Noel stamps. I loved this stamp set. I thought it was one of those that was had lots of different elements in it, and there's actually sort of a second part of that and the beautiful dies that also go with it. But I just want to concentrate on this one stamp set today because I think it sort of loans itself to hopefully what I'm going to achieve today. So we shall see. So let's have a go. I have got virtually all of the stamps out of this case with the exception of this one here. That's for another day. I've got the word joyous. I haven't taken out, and the little to and from, but everything else I've taken out, and we're going to use those today to see what we come up with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create actually 4 cards today. I figured if I was doing something like this, then I need to really go out of my comfort zone and let's have a go. So what I've done, I've taken a piece of basic white cardstock and I'm going to stamp on this. You've probably seen lots of people do it where you stamp your design and then you chop it into 4 to make your 4 cards. I just thought it'd be a really nice sort of way to me to kind of get out of my comfort zone a little bit and have a little play. So let's get cracking. So I'm going to start off with my biggest stamp because the other stamps I can use to fill in gaps, whereas this one I want to be prominent. Now I'm going to be using StazOn today. The reason I'm using StazOn is I'm going to be doing a little bit of watercolouring, just very lightly, but I want to be able to use water without having too much concern about the things running and stuff like that. I am using just basic white cardstock, so you do need to be a little bit careful when you're using water because it is quite absorbent and it doesn't, the colour doesn't spread like it would on watercolour paper, but it's still very doable and it's still very easy to use, provided you don't use too much water. Okay, so first thing I've done is put my finger in the ink pad, which is not a good start. So as I say, I'm just using StazOn ink pad. Now, this is a brand new stamp set, so I haven't inked this yet, but I'm going to just make sure it has a nice covering. Okay, now what I want to do is to line up this bottom section and the top of that holly leaf. I'm just going to go up a little bit from the centre. Now remember, when you're using StazOn, you do need to work quite quickly. I was lucky there because I did leave that a little while before I stamped. StazOn is alcohol based, so you can't use this with your stamping blends. And as I say, the ink does dry quite quickly, so you do need to just stamp reasonably quickly as well. Okay. And I'm going to repeat that 4 times. I don't want to overlap, so I'm not going in quite as far this time. I'm going to fill these little pieces with other bits and bobs, so they will be filled, but we just want to keep the main part free from overlapping at this stage. Okay, right, so that's all in place, so I'm quite happy with that, and I'm going to end up with 4 cards with the corners in different sort of orientations really. So what I want to do is put some colour down on this first, and then I'll do some more stamping to fill in the gaps, because normally when you do this technique you do solid stamps so that you would build up the colours and they'd be on top of each other, but I'm going to be watercolouring today, so I want to make sure that I'm getting enough colour down on there. So I've chosen 3 different greens to work with. I'm using Shaded Spruce, Garden Green and Granny Apple. And then I'm going to use Real Red for the berries, and maybe a little bit of Balmy Blue as well. I'm not sure about that yet, so we'll see how we go. So I'm going to start with my greens. Now, so what I will do is I will record part of this, of me painting, because I'm sure you don't want to watch the whole thing, but you can get the idea. Okay, right. So now when I'm watercolouring, as you can see, what I've done is I've squidged some colour into the lids. If I'm going to be doing a lot of watercolouring, what I tend to do is to put some ink onto blocks and work from the blocks rather than the actual ink pad. So it's entirely up to you which way you want to do it. I will tell you which colours I'm using as I go. Okay, so I'm going to start with this one here. So what I want to do is to take a piece of kitchen roll, and I've just got plain water and just a really cheap but thin little brush, which I'm going to use on my paper. And my brush is virtually dry, but I'm just laying a little layer of water down just to moisten it slightly, and it will help with the actual colours once I start painting. Now I want this to be a rough watercolour, so I'm not going to be spending hours and hours shading and stuff like this. I want it to be quite natural. So I'm just laying down that first layer, and then I'm just going to add a little bit more to build it up. So can you see you've got some tones going on there. Now I'm going to let that dry before I go back and maybe touch it up in a moment. So I'm using Garden Green for my holly. So I'm going to do the same again for all the holly leaves. And so you don't want too much water on your brush, but I just like to use a reasonable amount. It just helps for the ink to flow across the paper, that's all. And don't worry if it looks a little bit patchy at this stage, we can go back and deal with that. The important thing is that you don't work the paper too much. So I'm just using the one colour for this stage. We might go back, I might go back and add some darker touches to it. We'll see. It's going to be quite organic as we go, as I say. Now, if you don't put a water base down, it's fine as well, but I just find that helps it to flow just that little bit, and stops it becoming too patchy, because it can become quite patchy. But my brush is virtually dry. It's not, once I've laid that water down, I've then taken most of the water off onto my tissue. Now, I'm naturally, I like layers. I like to build up textures. So single layer cards are, as I say, a little bit out of my comfort zone, really. I'm not a simple stamper, far from it, and it kind of, it's a good challenge, because sometimes we fall into our own little ruts of our style. You can often tell who's made a card by just people's styles, and it's quite interesting when someone goes out of their comfort zone a little bit, because it's sort of it's their creative side coming out, and you can kind of really see what's happening. So it's lovely, but yeah, definitely out of my comfort zone, but it's fun nevertheless, so that's the main thing. I'd always say, because I have a lot of ladies who say to me, I can't paint, I can't paint. I can't paint either. I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination. But I love to play, and it is just paper and ink at the end of the day. So just have a play and enjoy it. Don't worry about whether you think you can paint or not. You might be surprised with your results. Sometimes I'm very surprised, and I think, oh, that's not too bad. And then other times it goes straight in the bin. So it's just a case of just having a play. So I'm not spending a huge amount of time on this. I'm just adding some colour. I can go through and touch up on everything afterwards. But I think you can see by just adding that little water wash, what it enables the ink to do is to find those areas that are wet, and it will naturally sort of go there and sort of start sinking into the paper itself. So rather than it going on completely dry, it's just giving it that little area to go find. Now, if you're using watercolour paper, of course, this is a lot easier, because obviously that is designed to soak up your actual ink. So it's a lot more forgiving, shall we say. This isn't always very forgiving, but we can usually disguise our mistakes if we have any. Now I'm just using a really cheap paintbrush here, like super cheap. I buy these by the job lot from Amazon or eBay or one of those, and just correcting a little mistake there. And I usually buy about 50 at a time. They're really cheap. They're great for classes because although they're cheap, their quality is actually okay if you're not an artist. And they're kind of, I can give them to my class ladies. They can take them away with them, and that's great. You can also use the water painter, of course. I do use the water painter quite often, but I tend to use it without water in the actual chamber, because I find that sometimes it's hard to control the flow. Especially, it's not so bad if you're on watercolor paper, but if you're using basic white, it's sometimes really hard, and you suddenly get quite a blob of water, and it's quite hard to control. Whereas if you don't put water in the actual chamber and just use it as a conventional paintbrush, it's much easier to control, and I prefer that. That's just how I like to work. Okay, so I'm going to now go back over where I've just been, and I'm just going to add some little highlights, lowlights, whatever you want to call them, just to bring in some depth, because remember, we're a single layer, so we're not getting depth with things like dimensionals or things like that, although we might have a few embellishments go on the top, but we're trying to create like a natural depth, really. So just spend a little time, just go back over, but just remember not to overwork the paper. So if you feel that the paper's starting to give a little bit, just let it dry, because it's not overly forgiving once you've gone too far, if that makes sense. So just give it a little time to dry between layers. And the other thing is when I'm actually painting onto here, my paintbrush isn't really touching the paper hardly at all. I'm sort of tickling the top of it really, so maybe you will get to see me paint the whole thing, I'm not sure. So just by allowing that first layer to sort of dry, I'm just moving on. It kind of, it means that you can get that depth of colour on your extra layers. Oops, I missed one there. So again, just going to squish. I need a little bit more colour into my lid. Because I'm using quite traditional colours today, but again, if you like non-traditional colours, this could look really stunning in pinks and greys and things like that. So use your imagination and just have a play. You see me keep wiping my brush. It's because I don't want it to be too wet. I'd rather have to go back with another layer than try and make it too wet. So I'm not taking too much time. I want it to look quite natural. Don't be afraid to move your paper around as well. If you're struggling to get into an area or something like that, then just... And the other great thing is I can see I've just gone over a little bit here. So I'm just going to use clean water, and you can generally lift most of that colour away if it's gone too over the edges for you. Okay, so I'm going to move on from the holly for a moment. So I've got Granny Apple Green and I've got some shaded spruce here. So I think I'm going to use Granny Apple Green on these leaves here. So again, I'm just watering it, let the colour flow. I love Granny Apple Green. It's just a really vibrant, it's great for spring cards, but it's also really great for adding sort of different tones. It's got that yellowness to it, which incidentally, so does Old Olive. Gosh, I couldn't think of the name of it. Old Olive has very yellow tones in it as well. So it's another good one for if you want to add some yellow as opposed to like a real green. So I'm not trying to be perfect here. I'm literally just trying to create some different tones and get some depth into the actual piece itself. Old Olive also has some brownie tones as well, so that's quite good for autumnal sort of greens. It kind of just but we've got a nice lot of greens to choose from, so it's you can play around to your heart's content. And you see I'm leaving some of the areas really quite light of that green, and that just helps to build up that depth a little bit. Oh, I didn't water that one. I could feel instantly that it wasn't flowing off my brush properly. So if you'll know, but just by laying that water down, it just helps it to flow. So pretty. You could also use Stampin' blends for this if you wanted to. Obviously, you would need to use Memento as opposed to Stays On to stamp your images, but you could, I forgot to wet that one again, provided you use the right ink, then that would work really well as well. Depending on what you like, you could use your watercolor pencils, anything, whatever, you know, whatever medium is your choice of medium, really. I like them all, so I tend to just sort of play, and don't be afraid to mix them as well, because sometimes you want a little bit more depth, or you want the colours to be more intense, which the blends obviously do. I wanted this to be reasonably soft, so hence why I've gone the watercolour route, but just play, do what you want. And as I say, just remember it's just paper and ink at the end of the day. So, you know, I often have pieces that I do and I think, oh, don't like that, that can go in the bin. But then sometimes you can walk away from it and let it dry, and, you know, come back the next day and you think, actually, that's not too bad. I'm sure I could do something with that. So don't be too hasty in chucking your what you think is disasters away, because sometimes they actually work out to be really good. Okay, I'm going to let that dry whilst I move on to these pieces here and my berry stems. So I'm going to be using shaded spruce for this, and I am actually going to grab a block and just add some ink onto my block for this one. So obviously this is stamped in black, so I'm never going to colour it entirely over the top, but what I do is I tend to just use my brush to one side of the black line, and it will take away that harshness of the black. And then you bring in that extra tone. So I'm going to actually, I was going to use it with the stems for the berries as well, but I think yeah, I think they might benefit from a sort of brownie colour, maybe an espresso or something like that. We'll have a play in a minute. So don't be afraid just to have a play. Remember, we look at these things very closely, but our recipients are just almost grateful to receive a handmade card, and they're not going to look at the finer detail like we do. We're our own worst critics, and that's probably goes for most of us, I would think. Okay, so I've added those. So I'm just going to go back over some of these granny apple leaves and just add a little bit more depth. Remember, what you lay down always looks darker than when it dries, so don't panic if you find that you think, oh crikey, that's a bit dark. Once that dries, that's going to dry a lot lighter. Can look quite flat sometimes. I know that's what we're trying to achieve in the sense of a flat card, but we don't want the actual images to look too flat, if that makes sense. This will start to pop as well once we get the red berries going. Okay, so now I'm going to go in on the berries. But I'm going to start off, I think, with some early espresso. See, this has already been used as a palette. I'm not being too precise about it. I'm just literally just adding a little bit of brown. I just thought it would look nicer rather than just all green. grey. And then we're going to go with real red. Now I'm going to grab another block for red, only because it can get quite messy red, so I don't want to leave my ink pad open. Now if you wanted to, you could use a marker for these if you wanted them to be deeper in colour, or however you want them to be really. And again, I'm not I don't want to make them perfect. I want to, you know, see some depth in it. So just don't be afraid to sort of change the shape a little bit just by, you know, kind of not colouring the whole thing in, leaving some white bits around. Don't overthink it, because it's those little white bits and the little gaps that actually add that depth to what you're trying to achieve. And notice I haven't wet these areas first, purely because they're such a small area, so I kind of just want to just lay colour straight down, and I want it to be quite vibrant. I think sometimes when we're doing stuff like this, we do overthink it a little bit, and I think you just need to be a little bit freer. And you can see already how it's sort of beginning to pop a little bit. I'd say my brush is virtually dry here. I'm just literally just kind of going over, picking up more ink, and now I can feel that's getting a little bit, it kind of drags. So that's when you know that you just need to wet your brush again and start again. It shouldn't drag across the paper. My temptation always would have been to like completely fill these berries with colour, to make them sort of really just completely red, but by leaving the little white bits, that's adding sort of a shadow. It's kind of like where a light might hit the berry, because they're normally shiny, aren't they, the berries? And then if you want to go over and add some darker areas, you can. Again, I'm not going all over, I'm just maybe at the base a little bit. I always get a dry throat when I'm doing this, talking too much. See, I've just gone over the edge a little bit there, so I'm just using a completely clean paintbrush, and hopefully it will lift it a little bit. Okay, now I don't want to overcomplicate this because I'm actually beginning to really like it, the simple way that it is. So I'm not going to add too much other detail. What I want to do is to add some texture. Okay, so I mentioned about bringing in the Balmy Blue. So what I'm going to do is, Balmy Blue is obviously quite light. So I'm just going to bring a blending brush in. And I'm going to work it from the middle. And just work out. I might have to do something with this one here. You can see where that water leaked. That one might have to be a 2-layer. I can see a sentiment going over the top of it. I wouldn't waste it. Don't waste it because it's you know, it's there to be used, as they say. Now, because Balmy Blue is quite light, I'm actually not affecting too much the coloured areas that we've already done. But of course, if you did use a darker colour, then you're going to sort of distort your own colours that you've painted. So you do need to be a little bit careful. My Balmy Blue could actually do the re-ink if I'm honest, but I knew I was going to be using it for this and I didn't want to re-ink it and then have a really splodgy mess. So mine is extremely light, but if provided you don't put too much pressure on, you'll manage to get it really light. So I'm building up my layers, where you'll probably find that if you've got your ink pad is slightly inkier, you won't need to do that. But also, if your ink pad is slightly inkier, just rub some of it off on the side. It won't hurt it. This has definitely got to have a sentiment across this one. Okay, so the other thing I think I'm going to use on the blue is this little, I don't know what you'd call it really, sort of a sweet little pattern here. I'm just going to ink it up very lightly, and I'm not going to use it in its full capacity. I'm just kind of adding parts of it to the areas of the Stampin'. It's not in any way sort of form or any particular order. I'm literally just adding some little bits of interest. And you'll notice I'm not actually putting the stamp down completely. I'm kind of using the edges a little bit. I don't want to do too much on there. And the other thing I do really like is speckles. So I'm going to bring in a bigger brush. And this is Early Espresso I'm using. I'm going to water it down a fair bit. This is where your water painters actually do come in really handy. In fact, now I've mixed that up, let me get one of my water painters. So I want this reasonably watery because I want it to be flickable, I think is the word. And I want to flick. And don't worry too much if you get watermarks. I love watermarks on things, so it will just make your background really pretty. Okay, so I just want that to dry for a moment because I'm going to put some sentiments onto the actual pieces themselves. So we'll just give that one moment. I can feel it's drying quite nicely. You don't want to smudge it like I've just done. Patience is a virtue, as my mum would have said. Something I don't have a great deal of, but it's also an opportunity for a creative change. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to cut these into 4 now. I will trim it at some point, but for now I'm just literally going to cut these into 4. Okay, because then we can have a look at where everything is and where we want to add our sentiments, okay? So we've got this beautiful Noel, which I think might sit nicely there. So I'm going to do it in red. Now the beauty of the clear stamps, of course, is that we can actually see where we are stamping. Although with the camera above me, it's very hard for me to see. But there we have our Noel. Now, also what would be quite nice, and I don't know whether I dare try this, I'm going to try it on this one, just in case it goes terribly wrong. So I'm going to clean my Noel stamp. And I'm just going to ink the N and the O. I want to make sure it's nice and clean. I'll make sure these all dry and clean. I'm going to put that N over where my little blob is. I'm going to clean the stamp again, and again make sure it's nice and clean. And then I'm going to come back and just ink the E and the L. Just make sure it's dry as well, because the last thing you want is sort of a little image. Oh, I'm going to go off the page here, look. But you get the idea. So that way you can actually use it in a long line as opposed to the 4, which I think is lovely. Obviously, I was trying to cover that ink as well. That one's going to have a second layer on it. So we're just, I said it would be a touch and go, didn't I? So we'll leave that one to one side. So let's try and do this again with... So I'm just getting the E and L this time. Make sure it's nice and clean. And then I'm going to ink the N and the O. Again, just make sure everything's dry and clean. Oops. Oh, can you see? I've just missed a tiny little bit of ink on the bottom there. That's my fault, so I'm just going to grab a real red pen. Where there's a will, there's a way. So that's another one. And finally, this last one, I'm not going to use Noel this time. I'm going to use Making Spirits Bright. Now, this is the one I smudged slightly. So again, I'm just going to try and position it so it hides as much as possible where I've smudged that slightly. Again, remember our recipients are not going to be looking too much at that, so don't worry too much. Okay, now what I want to do, I want to add a little bit more texture. So I thought it would be quite nice to use a couple of embossing folders. We've got a couple of really nice ones that I thought would be good for this technique. So this is our new one that's available with the Very Cute suite, and it's called Snowflake Sky. So you can see it's quite a detailed one, but it's beautiful with the snowflakes. So I'm just going to position it where I would like, and I'm going to pop it through my machine. So there we go. If we can't have layers, we can have textures. So I think that works really well. I like that. The other one is the what is this called? Time Worn Type. So it's a sort of a bit of old-fashioned sort of type, really. So I'm going to pop this in as well. When you position it, you just want to make sure that if there's any great detail, that it's not going to sort of detract from your design. Okay. So what I've actually done, and it was by mistake, I will admit, I've actually done it on the deboss side, but I actually quite like that. I think that's quite pretty. So let's try and do it the other way. So just so as a reminder, really, where the emblem is, that's the right way up, so that you're going to get the embossed image. I somehow flipped it and I got the debossed, but as I say, sometimes the debossed are as nice as the embossed. So okay, so then you can see for yourself which one you prefer. I actually quite like both. I think they're both really pretty. Okay, so next thing I want to do is now to trim these to go on my cards. Now I've used plain white cards for these because I think it just kind of loaned itself to being quite plain, really. So I've got 3 cards there. So the 4th one, that might be a bin job, that one, but we'll see. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim them at different sizes. So I'm in the UK, we're in metric. So I'm going to do this top layer 10 by 14.35. And then I will do this one at 13.85. by 9.5. I'm doing those all different for you so you can see how different they will look. Keep all these little bits as well because they're really handy for sometimes insides of cards and stuff like that. So this time I'm going to go even smaller. So what side did we do that one? 9.5, didn't we? So I'm going to go at 9 this time. And this one's going to be 13.35. Okay, so I've done them all different sizes so that we can see how they look. Just make sure that all my openings are correct. I've done 2 landscape and 1 with the fold at the top. Now, it's taken every bone in my body to not put a layer of red. But single layer. So that's what we're going with. But of course, you know, you can add whatever you wish to your own designs. And then finally we have this one here. That leaves virtually no border. So there are our 3 designs. Now, of course, we have to have some embellishments on top. We cannot have a card without some kind of embellishment. The challenge was good, but we need something on top, don't we? So somewhere around here I got out some embellishments, which I can't find at the moment. So I found them. These are the adhesive backed glitter sequins, and again these are part of the Berry Cute suite, but I thought they worked really well with this in both the green, the blue and the clear one actually. So we'll use a bit of each, I think. So on this one I'm going to use green. Have to have some, don't we? This one I'm going to use the blue, and again I'm just going to cover a little bit of that little splodge I made. I just add that little bit of sparkle, and we do like a bit of sparkle at Christmas, don't we? I'm actually going to put a couple of clear ones on here as well. And then finally on this one, I'm just going to use the clear, I think. So there you go. That is my attempt at a single layer card. I have to say, I do quite like them. They are quite pretty. Not necessarily my style, not necessarily my choice. But having said that, it's really nice sometimes to put yourself out of your comfort zone and have a little play. And I just thought this sort of stamp set loaned itself to that, really. I made some really pretty sort of simple cards, really. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I can't wait to see what everyone else has come up with. So take care. See you soon. Bye.